Hey, do you have 90 seconds? If so, let's dive into the Come Follow Me storyline together. Before Nephi died, he did two important things. First, he established a king over his people, and we don't know what this new king's name was because the people loved Nephi so much that they just called their kings Nephi after that. And then second, Nephi would likely have given this new king the large plates, and we're told he gave his little brother Jacob the small plates. And if you're confused about the difference between the small and large plates, I'll include a link right here, and it's a 1-minute explanation of the difference between the two. Now, next, our beloved Nephi died, and it didn't take long for things to fall apart. Now, we can't blame this on Jacob, though. Jacob was a great prophet. Seriously, we find out in this week's reading that his faith was so great, he could literally move mountains. But despite Jacob's goodness, the Nephites were becoming more rebellious and wicked. So in response to the people's wickedness, Jacob was told by the Lord to teach the Nephites in the temple. Now, it's important to remember that ancient temples weren't like our modern temples. So Nephi said he built their temple like the one in Jerusalem. And so there would have been areas in the temple that it would have been okay to gather and be taught, just like Jesus did when he was alive. Now, while Jacob taught the Nephites, he called on the ones who were being so wicked to repent already. And possibly sensing that their hearts were really hard and they needed some fear tactics to wake them up, he warned that the land would be cursed and the Lamanites would take over if they didn't repent. And then Jacob gave the wicked Nephites the old 1-2. He taught that the Lamanites were wicked because their parents had led them to be, and the wicked Nephites didn't have that excuse. And then as a final whammy, he said that the Lamanites were more righteous than the Nephites because they obeyed the law of chastity. And that's what's happening in Come Follow Me this week. All right, question of the week, my friends. Have you ever done archery? And if you have, do you know what happens when you take your eye off of the mark? So when my family moved to Colorado, we didn't have any friends yet, and so we decided to take up the hobby of archery. And archery I thought would be really cool, like we'd be a Lord of the Rings family, we'd all be like Legolas. But I quickly learned that it's actually super hard, and you have got to be incredibly focused. And one of the first things that we were taught when we all lined up to do our archery was that you have got to keep your eye on the mark. You could not, if somebody asked you a question, you couldn't go, what? Because what would happen if you took your eye off the mark is that you could shoot your toe, you could shoot the ceiling, or much more tragically, you could shoot someone else. So keeping your eye on the mark is critical in archery, and also, wouldn't you know it, in spiritual things. These are the verses I really hope that you'll dive into this week, doing verse mapping on them, and I am going to verse map with you just one of these verses, and it teaches us about spiritual archery and spiritually keeping your eye on the mark. You guys, I'm dying. I'm editing this video, and for the entire section of verse mapping, I'm just looking down. Like, I don't know what happened. I think maybe I got super into it and I thought I was like studying alone and just talking out loud. So excuse me while I totally ignore you and just pay attention to my study, but here we go. So let's dive into Jacob chapter 4, verse 14. So the first thing we need to do is just write down the verse that we're going to be studying, Jacob 4, verse 14. And for context, we're looking at this. Who's talking? Why are they talking? What are they saying? Let's look at all of that. Okay, so who is talking? It looks like this is the prophet Jacob, and this is after he's finished speaking in the temple. So he's not talking specifically to the Nephites. It looks like maybe he's just writing down these words. And so he's really saying this, not just to the Nephites, but to you and to me. And so why is he saying this? Well, it looks like if you look back at verses 10 and 11, before this, he's really talking about stop trying to be smarter than the Lord. Stop trying to counsel him. Stop trying to be the boss of life and just let yourself be guided by the Lord. Okay, now we're actually going to write down the words of this verse. So he says, but behold, the Jews were a stiff-necked people, and they despised the words of plainness, and killed the prophets, and sought for things that they could not understand. Wherefore, because of their blindness, which blindness came by looking beyond the mark, they must needs fall. Now, what are the key words in there? What do you think are the key words that we should find definitions to? I think stiff-necked, plainness, blindness, and maybe the mark. So let's look up those words. Okay, so as I'm looking it up here, it looks like my 1828 Webster's Dictionary, which I use that one because it reflects the language of Joseph Smith's day. It doesn't have stiff-necked. So let's just look up stiff. Okay, I really like this one. Hardy, stubborn, not easily subdued. And we know that the neck is kind of like, it controls the head, right? Where the neck goes, the head goes. And so it's an unwillingness to see things maybe God's way. Okay, so they despise the words of plainness. Interesting. So they don't like things that are artless, simple, clear, open, sincere. I think plainness almost could be a synonym for goodness here. So they don't like the words of God. They don't like the words of goodness. Okay, now let's look at this blindness. Oh, this is good. Okay, so blindness, it's not blindness of sight here, that first one. It's a want of intellectual discernment. It's ignorance. So it's because of their lack of discernment, their inability to tell the difference between what is good and what is evil, that they then, it says, they look beyond the mark. Now let's look up what the mark is. Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so any object used as a guide or to which the mind may be directed. Okay, so we figured out the context and we understand it because we've interpreted these words, but this is the point at which most people stop, and we're not going to stop. We are going to then apply it, and that is where the scriptures become powerful. So one thing that is super helpful when you study the scriptures is figuring out the principle that the verse teaches. Like, what is the lesson here that Jacob is teaching that can apply to me in 2024? It's 2024, right? I think so. So the easiest way I found to do this is to ask myself, what is the point? Like, why did Jacob bother writing this? The space on the small plates was minimal. What was the point of him writing this? I think that he wanted the Nephites and us to understand that we need to have soft hearts, soft necks. Is that a thing? We need to have soft necks, soft hearts, and be willing to focus our eyes on Jesus. Okay, now the next thing we do to make this really powerful is to make it personal. So we understand the principle now, but what does it have to do with you and me? So I'll tell you what I'm thinking for me.
Should be quite an interesting story.
Do I actually keep my eyes on Jesus all of the time? Or do I set my priorities by what I want to do? Is my mark maybe being entertained? Is my mark being right? Do I have to be right in all situations? Is my mark maybe being lazy because I just don't want to do work today? What is my mark? What is the thing I might be prioritizing over Jesus? And now this last part, so powerful, is actually adding power by taking a tiny action. And this tiny action is going to be 5 minutes or less. And I think what I'm going to do today is that I am going to write out a to-do list for my day. And then I am going to ask myself, say a little prayer in my heart, Lord, what would thou have me to do? And then I will change my to-do list based on what I feel. Now, the important thing here too is to transfer all of this to your own scriptures. It's great to have a journal, but it's also awesome to have this information in your own scriptures, and so that you have that forever. Make sure that you dive into those other 2 key scriptures from this week and verse map those as well if you've got some extra time. All right, let's see if we can prove the Book of Mormon is true by using the book itself as evidence. So before Nephi passed on the small plates to his brother Jacob, he gave some serious commandments about how the plates were to be kept and written on. So let's double check those back in Jacob 1. Okay, right there in verse 2, it says the first requirement is that this is a commandment. You are commanded to write on the plates. This is not optional. If you are given the plates, it's a commandment to write on them. Okay, right in that verse as well, it says that Jacob was told that he should write on them. So he couldn't have a scribe write them. He couldn't pass on the responsibility to someone else. Whoever was given the responsibility for the record had to personally write the record. Okay, and then Nephi tells him what should be written on it. And because it's the small plates, it's the spiritual record, he says, only write the things that are most precious. And then in addition to that, in verse 3, he says, don't worry about the history, touch on that very lightly, and then mostly just use the room to write spiritual things. Okay, next rule is that these plates need to be preserved. Do not let them fall into the hands of wicked Nephites, or even worse, of the Lamanites. They need to be kept and preserved. And then verse 3, it also points out that the small plates are to be handed down by lineage. So this is going to stay in Nephi's family. Now, how in the world is this evidence that the Book of Mormon is true? Well, you'll notice as you go through the rest of the small plates, and the small plates are from 1 Nephi through Omni, that the authors do a pretty good job of sticking to these rules, these commandments that Nephi gave. And this includes guys that even admit that they're wicked. Omni straight up says, I myself am a wicked man. Obviously, everybody doesn't do it perfectly. You'll especially notice as we get to the end, the space is running out, and so it gets shorter and shorter and shorter what these guys do. But everybody tries to check all of the boxes, it seems like. And the good people over at evidencecentral.org actually put this into a table, and I'm recreating it here for you so you can see what these commandments were, who kept them, and where it says that they kept them. Now, here's the point, here's the evidence, is that Joseph Smith, the translation process, modern day scholars actually put it at possibly as few as 57 days. Now, if you look, the Book of Mormon, let me double check so I don't say anything wrong. Okay, the Book of Mormon is 531 pages long, and Joseph Smith translated it in as few as 57 days. Do you really think that he could have kept track of those commandments that Nephi gave and made sure that all of these authors checked the boxes of all the things that Nephi said? No, oh my goodness, no. You guys, the Book of Mormon is so packed with Hebraisms and these literary consistencies that Joseph Smith could not possibly have kept track of over that short period of time. The Book of Mormon is true.